There is a question many people secretly fear to ask themselves. If I disappeared tomorrow, how many people would truly notice? For some, the honest answer is a silence, so deep it feels like an echo. Not because they are unlovable, not because they are cold, but because, somewhere along the way, they quietly became the person with no friends. We see them everywhere, yet never truly see them. The colleague who always eats alone, the neighbor whose light is on late at night, but no one ever knocks, the name that never appears in group photos, the person who blends into every room like a soft shadow. And society has repeated one convenient lie for far too long, that people without friends are difficult, closed off, or simply not trying hard enough. But what if that is not the truth at all? What if their quietness is not avoidance, but the echo of everything they have survived? The psychology of those who have no friends. Is there something wrong with them, or are they simply choosing to live alone? The truth is not that simple. Behind that silence lie wounds they do not know how to share with anyone, and survival mechanisms they themselves cannot even name. There is a long-standing misunderstanding society has carried for far too long, that people without friends are difficult, cold, or simply unwilling to belong anywhere. We see them standing alone, eating alone, moving through gatherings without leaving much of a trace, and we quickly conclude that they are the kind of people who don't need connection. But what if the truth is the complete opposite? What if that quietness is not rejection, but the result of everything they've lived through? What if they are not avoidant, but simply people who have been hurt too many times to take one more step toward others? The psychology of people without friends is nowhere near as simple as their calm exterior. In fact, sometimes it is an inner landscape with far more layers than most people can imagine. There are people who enter our lives like soft shadows, gentle, polite, never causing trouble. They work hard, behave kindly, maintain respectful boundaries. But amid the noise and motion of the world, they feel like a quiet pause. A pause that many misunderstand. With just a bit of attention, you begin to notice the tiny signs they always try to hide. A slight hesitation when someone asks, "So who's your best friend?" A strained smile when they hear stories about reunions or old friend groups, or that empty look in their eyes when they realize they have no one to call on the days they feel low. These signs are small, subtle, but enough to reveal that beneath that calmness is not emptiness, but a story that has never been told. Look deeper, and you will see a paradox. The loneliest people are not the ones who lack emotion. On the contrary, they are the ones who feel too much. So much that every small tremor of life leaves a mark on their heart. They are not cold, they are not indifferent, and they are not antisocial. If anything, they are the ones who are sensitive to every breath of emotion. They hear the change in someone's tone within half a sentence. They see the sadness behind a smile. They sense distance in a simple nod. They hear silence in ordinary conversations. This sensitivity, if placed in the right environment, would be a rare gift. But when placed in environments filled with hurt, it becomes the very reason they withdraw slowly, quietly, repeatedly. Imagine a child once ignored by their peers, a teenager who was laughed at the moment they opened up, an adult betrayed by the very person they trusted most. These wounds did not make them angry or destructive. They taught them silence. They taught them to shrink. They taught them speaking is not safe. Opening up is not safe. Closeness is not safe. And so, one day, they step into adulthood with that quiet demeanor, a calmness everyone mistakes for liking to be alone. But that is not the truth. It's not that they don't need anyone. It's that they have become too accustomed to the feeling of having no one. That is the part most people fail to see. Those tiny wounds, so small no one noticed, are precisely what built the invisible wall they've carried for years. A wall not meant to hide emotions, but to prevent pain. If you look deeply enough, you'll realize people without friends are rarely the ones who reject connection. They are the ones who once craved it the most. But the more they craved, the more they were hurt. The more they tried, the more they were disappointed. The more they wanted to be seen, the more they were forgotten. So they choose to stand at the edges not because they want to, but because they are too exhausted to try again. And the deeper you look, the more another paradox appears. We often think they are hard to approach, but the truth is, they are simply protecting themselves from the most familiar pain of all, the pain of being abandoned. Have you ever met someone like that? Or do you recognize a part of yourself in these words? Because sometimes, a person without friends is simply someone who no longer believes they are important enough for anyone to walk toward. Sometimes, they are not avoiding life. They are avoiding memories they do not want to relive. And sometimes, they don't want to be a burden to anyone, so they choose to become a burden to themselves. If we set aside our assumptions, look past the surface, and peer into that quiet darkness, we will see that behind that silence is not emptiness, but a soul carrying things it has never been understood for. And when we finally recognize that paradox, we begin to wonder, are there silent signs, small shifts in their eyes, rhythms, or quiet pauses that reveal a loneliness even they cannot express? Those signs exist, very subtle, very gentle, and very often overlooked. If you look at someone without friends from the outside, what will you see? A calm face, an orderly life, a polite, gentle way of moving through the world, no conflict, no trouble. They smile at their co-workers. They answer appropriately in small conversations. Sometimes they are even the ones who make the group feel lighter because of their kindness. From a distance, they look completely fine. But true loneliness has a frightening ability. It disguises itself extraordinarily well. So well that no one, not even the person living with it, realizes when it first attached itself to them. Loneliness does not appear with sad eyes or a vacant expression. It arrives like a shadow, thin as breath, yet clinging tightly. It goes to work with them. It returns home with them. It sits beside them at every dinner, and lies next to them each night when darkness falls. On the outside, they still smile, still live, still work, still look perfectly fine. But inside, there is another world. A world where they constantly feel that no one truly knows who they are. They become a safe version of themselves, a role just pleasant enough not to bother anyone, just vague enough that no one asks too deeply. Day after day, they live in interactions that touch the surface of life, but never touch anyone's heart, and no one touches theirs. One of the quietest symptoms is this. They have joy, but no one to tell. They have sorrow, but no one to share it with. When they achieve a small victory, the joy fades as quickly as a light disappearing behind a closed door. When they are hurt, the sadness sinks silently inside them like a stone, unseen, untouched. They keep everything: joy, sadness, hope, disappointment, all placed into the same drawer, the drawer labeled, "No one needs to know." And then one day, all that remains inside them is a hollow space. Not the hollow of a weak person, but the hollow of someone who has no one willing to step into that inner room with them. If you want a clearer picture, imagine something very small. A person sitting at a table with a bowl of rice and a pair of chopsticks. They look at their phone, then put it down. There is no one to text, "I'm tired today," and no one to send a small, joyful photo to. Their life unfolds fully each day, but no one witnesses it. And that is the cruel essence of loneliness. Loneliness is not the absence of people around you. It is the absence of someone with whom you can be yourself. People without friends are not lacking in social interaction. They can talk often, work often, laugh often, but everything only touches the skin of life. It never reaches the deeper place where a person is seen, understood, and felt. That emptiness does not scream. It does not make them collapse. It simply flows quietly like a small stream of water that never stops, flowing through every day, every evening, every moment they realize they have no one to call first when something happens. Loneliness does not shout. It whispers, and it is precisely that whisper that makes it the most silent, the hardest to detect, yet the most painful symptom of all. And when you understand this, you begin to wonder, What could make someone who once felt so deeply learn to live so quietly? What makes a person become someone with no friends is not personality, and certainly not choice. It is a long journey of small wounds, quiet moments no one ever paid attention to. And those moments, piece by piece, form an entirely new psychological system. A system that keeps them standing outside every social circle of life. Things usually begin very early. Not with a grand betrayal, but with things that seem meaningless to everyone else. A moment when they shared something sincere, and someone laughed at the exact moment they needed to be heard. A moment when they trusted someone, only to watch that trust dropped on the ground with no one bothering to pick it up. A moment when they tried to belong, only to have their words or actions misunderstood in a way that wasn't truly them. No one thinks these small things carry any weight. But for them, each moment like that becomes a memory carved deep into the softest place in their heart. Hurt once, they can endure. But hurt many times, in the same way, the brain begins to remember. A region in the brain, designed to warn us of danger, begins to light up every time they are about to open up. The brain cannot distinguish emotional pain from physical pain. Being ignored, rejected, dismissed, these are all recorded as sharp, deep, stinging blows. And slowly, being near other people begins to feel too complicated. Every conversation becomes an invisible test. Every glance feels like a measurement. Every silence becomes a coded signal they struggle to decipher. They grow increasingly sensitive to every cue, and that very sensitivity makes them fear one more misstep. Fear opening up. Fear being misunderstood. Fear entering a room where it feels like no one truly wants them there. From fear, they begin to avoid. From avoidance, they begin to withdraw. Not all at once, but little by little. An invitation politely declined. A message left unanswered. A chance for connection allowed to slip away. Not because they don't want to try, but because every time they stand before the possibility of pain, their body whispers, "Don't, it hurt the last time." And so they slow down, speak less, open up less. Any relationship that feels uncertain, they leave first. Any group where they feel out of rhythm, they quietly disappear. Their world shrinks, not because they want to live alone, but because a smaller space hurts less than a larger one. That emptiness has its own logic. Once they grow used to facing everything alone, they gradually lose the habit of relying on anyone. And when they no longer rely on anyone, they also stop expecting anyone to rely on them. They do not blame, they do not resent, they simply become accustomed to the idea that no one truly needs them for life to feel complete. Accustomed to the fact that if they disappeared for a few days, no one would immediately notice. Accustomed to the silence that follows every attempt that once hurt them. Over time, they become someone with few friends. Then someone with no friends. A state that sounds heavy, but arrives very lightly, quietly, naturally. Like water receding after many dry seasons, leaving behind an empty lake bed no one knew was once full. There is something people rarely see. Someone without friends is not someone who doesn't know how to connect. They once knew, some even excelled at it. But each painful experience turned off a part of that instinct. Like a room that loses power so many times that a person stops trying to find the switch. They don't avoid society because they dislike it. They avoid it because their body has learned that stepping into the light often means risking abandonment again. This is not weakness. It is the mind's survival mechanism. The survival instinct of a heart that was once thin, once soft, once full of hope for people, until that hope was repeatedly placed in the wrong hands. And when you understand this, you begin to see people without friends differently. They are not strange, not difficult, not broken. They are simply living inside layers of memory they themselves no longer know how to speak about. And if you are gentle enough to look past those layers, you will see that they did not choose loneliness. Loneliness had already chosen them, many times over. When a person lives too long without having any friends, their inner world doesn't just change emotionally. It changes structurally. Their body and brain gradually adapt to a life without anyone who can truly see them. The lack of connection is not just an empty space in their schedule, it is a silent transformation in how they perceive themselves and how they perceive others. The first thing that happens is that the brain begins to function like a radar tuned too sensitively. When there is no one to exchange emotions with daily, the part of the brain responsible for analyzing social signals becomes more active than usual. They begin reading people's expressions with caution, sometimes to the point of excess. A quick glance can feel like a sign they are not welcome. A slow reply to a message makes their heart tighten, as if they have just done something wrong. Without friends, they lack chances for emotional calibration. So the brain is forced to guess. And when it must guess too often, it tends to assume the worst to protect them from disappointment. Then the body changes its rhythm too. Humans are social creatures. Connection was once crucial for our survival throughout evolution. When someone lives friendless for a long time, their body begins to interpret the state of being alone as a vague signal of danger. Their heart rate rises slightly. Cortisol levels fluctuate unpredictably. Sleep becomes fragmented, as if their body is standing guard over something it cannot name. They sleep, but not deeply. Rest, but not really rest. And when morning comes, they feel as if they have run a marathon in their dreams. These physiological shifts, all of them stem from not having anyone to lean on, from having no safe place called I belong. Then comes the mind. When someone lives too long in a space where no one touches their inner world, their sense of self begins to drift, like a sheet of paper floating on water. Without friends to reflect their real identity back to them, their self-image blurs. They no longer know if they are interesting, important, or worth someone's pause. Psychology calls this the loss of social mirroring, but to them, it is simply the very real feeling of slowly disappearing. Then emotions shift as well. People who go friendless for a long time often become quieter, not because they are sad, but because they lack opportunities to practice joyful emotions. Joy needs resonance. Sorrow needs sharing to shrink. Without anyone to share with, every emotion must find its own shelter inside them. Joy fades quickly. Sadness lingers long. And emptiness always remains a low, constant hum. The ears no longer notice, but the body hears clearly. There is another thing few people understand. When someone has no friends, their capacity for empathy may change, not because they grow colder, but because the brain needs social interaction to keep the empathy mechanism running smoothly. When reciprocal exchange is absent, their emotions don't expand outward. They begin to fold inward, like a hand that once held many things but now no longer remembers what to grasp first. Time also becomes a consequence. For someone without friends, days pass differently. No plans to look forward to. No conversations to recall. No small events worth naming. Time becomes flat, without anchors. A week, a month, sometimes slips by, leaving no trace that makes them feel they truly lived. And this flatness makes life feel like a colorless stream. But the deepest, quietest consequence is the way they view the world. When someone goes too long without friends, their mind leans towards self-protection. They no longer believe they can become part of any circle. Not because they lost hope, but because they fear placing hope in the wrong place again. This vigilance makes them enter rooms more gently, speak less, observe more. And sometimes, this unconscious caution makes others think they don't want closeness, leading to misunderstandings that push them away from the world, exactly as before. That is the spiral of the friendless. The lonelier they are, the more defensive they become. The more defensive they become, the more misunderstood they are. The more misunderstood they are, the deeper they retreat into their inner world. And from within that world, they look outward through a thin pane of glass, knowing they are alive, but unsure if they are truly seen. Yet, these very consequences give them the ability to perceive what others often overlook. They hear silence more clearly. They see sadness in others' eyes more easily. They understand the feeling of being lost as intimately as the palm of their hand. And this depth, though shaped by loneliness, becomes a quiet kind of light. A soft, subdued light, yet enough to remind them they are still alive, still feeling, still capable of opening themselves even just a crack to the world. And sometimes, in the long nights they have grown accustomed to, a faint sensation rises like leftover warmth in a room, long cold. A feeling that slows them down, making them wonder whether beneath all the layers of self-protection, their heart is still waiting for someone to truly see them. Not loudly, not urgently, just a small sliver of light, enough to know they never truly disappeared. There is something few people dare to say out loud. People without friends were not born to stand alone. They have simply stepped back too many times, until stepping back became a habit, the habit became a personality, and the personality eventually hardened into a shell they do not even realize they are wearing. And that shell over time becomes a self-isolating loop they themselves cannot pinpoint the beginning of. At first, they only walk away from a few conversations that make them uncomfortable, a party they choose to leave early, a message they intend to reply to but then leave untouched, an invitation they tell themselves they can get to later. And that avoidance seems harmless, like closing your eyes before a harsh light. But the strange thing is, every time they withdraw a little, the world withdraws from them a little too. Both sides drift apart unconsciously, neither meaning to, neither trying to hold on. And so they enter a strange phase, a phase where silence feels more familiar than the presence of other people. Their room is no longer a place to rest, but a wall behind which they watch life from a distance. No one knocks, no one enters, and slowly, they stop stepping out as well. In those days, they begin to believe they like being alone. But the truth is not so simple. Being alone can be comforting, but being alone too long becomes a shrinking, like a hand that once opened wide but, after staying cold too long, curls inward, and slowly forgets what it feels like to hold another hand. Then their mind begins persuading itself that everything is fine this way, that without connection, there is no pain. Without opening up, there is no abandonment. Without trusting anyone, there is no disappointment. They build stories for themselves that sound perfectly reasonable. So reasonable they eventually believe them so fully that whenever loneliness creeps in, they soothe themselves with, "This is still better." But deep inside their chest lies a truth they avoid looking at, that loneliness never disappears. It merely sits quietly, like a faint background note that keeps life from ever feeling whole. There are moments when they want to break out of the shell, to reply to that old message, to call someone they once knew, to say, "I miss something," to someone who once mattered. But just as they reach out, the familiar fear pulls them back. Fear of being ignored, fear of being rejected, fear that others are only being polite, fear of misreading small signals, fear of their own awkwardness, fear of being a burden. So they pull their hand back, again, and say, "Never mind," again, and retreat one more step from the world. That is the loop. A loop so invisible, yet so powerful, it can seal off their entire inner life. Want closeness, fear, avoidance, silence, deeper distance, even more fear, even more avoidance. The quieter they become, the more misunderstood they are. The more misunderstood they are, the more they want to hide. And the more they hide, the more they strengthen the belief that they don't fit with anyone. Old experiences become stamped verdicts, shaping them into a person they never wanted to be, but no longer know how to escape from. The painful truth is this: the loop never begins with selfishness or coldness. It begins with a heart that was once warm, that once wanted connection, that once craved to be understood. But after placing that heart in the wrong hands too many times, they learn to bury it deep, keeping anyone from touching it again. And in that overprotection, they unintentionally make themselves difficult to reach. Yet there is a gentle truth they haven't realized. The self-isolating loop is not a prison. It is merely a room with no windows. And the room is not locked. They can step out anytime, if they recognize they are inside it. The hard part is, most of the time, they don't realize it. They think it's personality, destiny. I'm just like this. But if you look deeply into these people, you will see no one is born like this. Every one of them was once a child who smiled when seeing someone they loved, once an adult who cried when misunderstood, once a heart that opened whenever it heard the call of belonging. And recognizing this, that they are not broken, only hurt, is where the loop begins to loosen. When they understand they are not damaged, they grow less afraid. When they are less afraid, they avoid less. When they avoid less, they begin to hear their own voice again. The voice of a part of them that has been buried for too long. The part that wants to be seen, to be touched, to sit beside someone without having to perform the safe version of themselves. And then something very soft happens. They begin to let go. Not out of despair, but because they start to realize they don't have to control everything. They don't have to read every cue. Don't have to guard every movement. Don't have to disappear to avoid judgment. Letting go here means letting go of the loop. Stepping out of themselves just one small step. Letting the wind slip through the cracked door. Opening a tiny path for closeness to return. Not as an expectation, but as a possibility. In that moment of letting go, they don't become someone new. They simply return to who they were before the loop closed. Someone who knows they can be hurt and still deserve warmth. Someone who knows their loneliness is not a sentence, but a whisper that it is time to step out of the old room. And when they take that step, even just one, the world finally begins to hear them. Not as a cry for help, but as the voice of a soul that has gone deep enough to finally know how to come home. There are people who have lived in silence for so long that they begin to believe it is their natural state. They grow used to no one asking about them, used to moving through crowds like a quiet shadow, used to ending each day with the familiar touch of emptiness. But then, at some point, no one knows exactly when a very small slit of light appears within that stillness. A kind of light that does not form a beam, does not dazzle, just a gentle warmth, like the first breath in a room that has been sealed for far too long. It often comes from the most ordinary things. A morning when suddenly they feel less heavy than the day before. A message they unexpectedly feel like replying to. A kind gesture that makes them pause for a few seconds. Or simply the moment sunlight falls across their hand and, in that brief instant, they realize they are still alive, still capable of feeling, still wanting something more than mere existence. Healing never arrives like thunder. It comes like a thin breeze, quietly stirring the parts inside them that once seemed dead, and they begin to realize something. Loneliness is not where they belong. It is merely where they sheltered before they knew where else to go. In that rare moment, they look at themselves not with judgment, but with a gentler gaze. They see clearly that all those years of shrinking were not a failure of the self, but simply how they survived when the world became too sharp, too cold, too ready to wound a heart that was always sensitive. When this understanding rises, they stop blaming themselves. And when they stop blaming themselves, they no longer feel ashamed of their loneliness. That is when their inner world softens. Not soft so that others can touch it, but soft so that they can breathe. They begin to let go of the old stories that once trapped them. I don't fit with anyone. I'm hard to be around. I was born to be alone. Those lines were once armor, but now they see they were only temporary coverings, not the truth of who they are. As this softness emerges, something else begins to grow. Gentleness. Gentleness toward themselves. They don't force themselves to change immediately. Don't push themselves to socialize. Don't shove their body into crowds pretending to be strong. They simply allow their heart to breathe at its own pace. And that alone is enough to set their inner world in motion. Then slowly, they feel the desire to take a small step outward, not to find someone else, but to find the part of themselves they once hid away. The part that knew how to smile, how to open up, how to believe in kindness. They step onto the balcony just to smell the morning air. They visit a cafe slightly more crowded, just to hear the murmur of conversations. They look at a passerby and notice they no longer fear eye contact the way they used to. No one notices these changes. But to them, these are the first heartbeats of a heart that has slept too long. As they begin to feel life again, the world begins to change color. A passing hello no longer makes them tense. Catching someone's gaze no longer makes them withdraw. An invitation, even if they're not ready to accept, no longer makes them want to run. They begin to realize the world is not always as cold as their past taught them. And in that awareness, they understand something essential. It's not that they don't deserve to have friends. It's that they have never been in the right place, at the right time, to meet the people who could truly touch them. They also understand that loneliness is not a lack. Loneliness is the time their heart needed to learn how to hear itself again. When this understanding becomes clear, they feel an unfamiliar lightness. They no longer feel anxious about needing someone beside them. No longer feel inferior because no one accompanied them in the past. No longer rush to fit in, just to fill an empty space. They feel fullness within themselves, a fullness they never knew when they were busy chasing external validation. They begin to realize, not everyone is meant to enter their inner world, and that is not a problem. People like them, those whose souls were once quieted, who have felt too deeply, who have walked through their own shadows, always recognize one another through very subtle signals. No noise, no performance, just a single look, and they can tell what valleys the other has crossed. And when they see the world with that clarity, they discover something they had never seen before. They are not broken. They are simply returning from years of shrinking to avoid hurt, returning from layers of defenses that were once necessary, returning from old patterns that no longer fit. They see their original self, a self that is gentle, deep, capable of love, but also deserving of the right kind of protection. And when they touch that self, they understand that true connection never comes from the number of people around them, but from the awareness they bring when their soul meets another. The door of healing opens from that very moment, a moment no one hears, no one sees, yet one that can change the entire direction of a life, not because they have found someone, but because they have finally found themselves. And when a person finds themselves again, every connection that comes after becomes right, and light, and real. In the end, after all the quiet months and silent years they have walked through, what awaits them is not a tragic conclusion, nor any judgment about what it means to have no friends. What awaits them is a truth so soft, so simple yet powerful enough to change the way they see themselves. They were never lacking anything to be loved. They were only lacking the chance to be seen correctly. People without friends often spend years believing that they are the problem, that they are too different, too quiet, too hard to understand, that they are less appealing than others, not as easy to approach, not interesting enough for anyone to stay. But the truth does not lie there. The truth lies in the fact that their heart once had to shrink in order to survive. And when a heart contracts for too long, it forgets its original shape. Yet that shape is still there, only hidden beneath too many layers of protection. And as those layers begin to soften, their true self emerges like a lake slowly thawing. A self not cold at all, but the very place where the most beautiful things reside. Sensitivity, subtlety, understanding, kindness, emotional honesty, and a depth few people have. The truth is this: a person without friends is often exactly the kind of person others would want, if only they allowed themselves to be seen. But they have walked through silence for so long that they believe they are nothing more than a shadow. What they don't realize is that even a shadow exists only because of light, and that light is them, the part of themselves they thought had vanished, but was merely waiting for the day it could return. One day, they will look back at their life with gentler eyes, no longer blaming themselves for every withdrawn hand, no longer aching over the days no one spoke their name, no longer hurting over the empty evenings. They will understand that all those empty spaces were simply pauses that allowed them to hear their own voice more clearly. And when they see themselves with that kindness, something strange happens. They begin to notice the small threads of connection that were always appearing around them. A smile from someone passing by, a simple question of concern, an unfamiliar gaze that feels warm instead of distant. Signals they once feared to welcome now become tiny bridges, reconnecting them to the world. True connection never comes from trying too hard. It comes from presence, and those who have been lonely for a long time are often the ones who can be the most deeply present when they finally open up again. Because they know how heavy silence can be. They know how a kind sentence can save a long day. They know how precious sincerity is in a world full of noise. That is their gift. Depth. And that depth is what makes them extraordinary friends. If someone reaches them at the right time, in the right way. But before they meet the right person, they must meet themselves. They must embrace the soft parts they once hid out of shame. They must look back at the childhood where they were overlooked, ignored, misunderstood. They must forgive the old versions of themselves who survived by shrinking. They must tell themselves the words they always wished to hear from someone else. I see you. I understand you. And you do not deserve to be left behind. At the moment they truly believe this, a door opens within. Not a door to others, but a door leading back to themselves. And when they return to themselves, the world outside becomes gentler, wider, capable of reaching them in ways they never expected. One day, they will meet someone who feels strangely familiar, someone who is not afraid of their silence, not confused by their depth, not impatient with the time they need to open up, someone who listens with presence instead of curiosity, someone who sees what they do not say. And in that moment, all the friendless years will no longer carry the color of sadness. They will carry the color of preparation that made them deep enough to understand that person, still enough to keep that connection steady, authentic enough not to lose themselves in being loved, grateful enough for all the years they walked alone. Sometimes, loneliness is not the absence of others. It is the journey toward reclaiming something precious, themselves. And when someone finds themselves again, they are never truly lonely anymore, even when standing alone in a silent room, because then, solitude is no longer darkness. It becomes space, space to breathe, space to feel, space to wait for the right people to arrive. And the right people will come, not loudly, not quickly. They will come the way sunrise appears after a long night, quiet, still, yet certain. And when that light touches them, they will understand what years of loneliness once made impossible to believe. They are worth being seen, worth being beside, worth being loved. Having no friends never made them lesser. It only made them more pristine for the journey of finding the people who fit. And when they finally meet that person, whether it is one or two, or only one kindred soul in a lifetime, they will understand that all the silence, all the empty nights, all the years spent standing outside of life, were preparing them for the moment someone's voice rises gently inside them. You too? I thought it was only me. That is the most beautiful recognition two once lonely souls can give each other. And that is where this story truly begins.